안녕하십니까. 오늘 게스트는 중국 안보와 군사 문제를 오랫동안 연구해온 스탠포드 대학의 오리아나 스카일러 마스트로 박사입니다. 오늘 대화는 최근 북중 관계의 주요 동향, 중국의 국제정세에 대한 이유와 우려, 동아시아 여러 곳에서 전쟁이 벌어질 가능성을 다룹니다. 북중러 삼각관계의 본질과 우리에게 필요한 전략적 선택지가 무엇일지 마스트로 박사와 논해보겠습니다.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Professor Orianna Skylar, Mastro, and then she's in Italy, which is beautiful. Floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm in Europe right now, and I think it really highlights how connected now Europe is to Asia, and how things that happen on the Korean Peninsula are so important also for obviously South Korea, but the rest of the world. So I have slides here that I can show if you want me to share them. These mainly highlight, go ahead and do that. They mainly highlight recent developments in the relationship between North Korea, China, and Russia. In this context, it's really important to understand some developments that are of great concern and some things that we still have to watch as we move forward. So in recent developments, just to highlight some of the things that have happened, there has been an alignment of these countries, but also a closeness between them that we haven't seen before. And in particular, I would highlight the closeness between China and Russia, and then Russia and North Korea. So it's not a completely symmetric type of triangle. I'll also mention early on that a lot of people also put Iran into this relationship and talk about Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. But in this context, as a China expert, I will tell you that Iran doesn't really have the same level of strategic alignment with China. And so I prefer to think about it as a triangle instead of an autocratic quad, as some might refer to it as. So between China and North Korea, the relationship, and I've written elsewhere, we have to be honest, this is not a good relationship. The two sides don't like each other. I remember 10 years ago, even more, 20 years ago, when I did my first research project in Beijing about their relationship with North Korea. At that time, a Chinese leader had not met with Kim Jong-un. They used to complain that the North Koreans would test during times that were sensitive to China, but that for strategic importance, mainly that China wanted to ensure a level of influence over events on the Korean Peninsula, they had to maintain the relationship. And so just last month, we saw that there was the anniversary of the signing of their treaty. And in effect, the treaty that China has with North Korea is its only military alliance. China, in the Cold War, signed this agreement, but has since decided that alliances are not the way to organize relationships with countries, and they prefer strategic partnerships. And so the relationship with North Korea is sort of a remnant of that. China continues to have influence over North Korea, in particular economic leverage, as they account for over 98% of the trade that North Korea has. And so just like Russia now, more and more after the war in Ukraine with the sanctions that Russia is facing, Russia is becoming more and more economically reliant on China, and so is North Korea. So it's an interesting alignment dynamic, because alliances are usually about military aspects, and we'll get to that in a second. But really for these countries, some aspects of the closeness of these relationships and the ability of these countries to wage wars or to be disruptive forces in the international system are not because China protects them militarily per se, but because China protects them economically. The Chinese do have very strong views about nuclear issues. This has come up in their relationship with the North Koreans and with the Russians. In May, they had a rare nuclear spat over nuclear rhetoric. We know that when the Russians were threatening nuclear use in Ukraine, in dialogues I've had with the Russians and the Chinese, it had been highlighted that China communicated very, very clearly to Russia that their relationship would be over if there was nuclear use. And so China tends sometimes to take a hard line when it comes to nuclear issues, as they have their own, limited retaliatory capability and no first use. So is there an autocratic access? I like to say that A lot of my research, some people think is too hawkish, some people think it's too dovish because it can be somewhat nuanced. These countries have in recent months taken on responsibilities that they've never taken on before, right? Chinese and North Korean troops took part in a military parade in Moscow. We know that North Koreans have been sent to fight on behalf of Russia and Ukraine, which was a first. Russia, meanwhile, has provided significant weapon systems to the DPRK, like fighter jets, surface-to-air missile systems, armored vehicles, missile technology, and food aid. And of course, North Korea also provided some things that Russia needed, like artillery shells, long-range missiles, as one of the main issues for the Russians in Ukraine has been a lack of munitions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is an alignment between these countries to the degree that, the United States really, or, allies like South Korea really need to try to push back against for two reasons. The first is, and I look to the Cold War here, these countries, their alignment with each other did not serve their strategic purposes during the Cold War. If anything, it caused a lot of issues across these countries that made it so they didn't only have to deal with their own strategic issues and threat environments, but that as other countries dealt with them, it impacted them. And in particular, I look at China and what China wants out of this relationship. And it's very clear that the Chinese government does not want to create the impression of a bloc between China, Russia, and North Korea. One, China loses a lot of leverage over the North Koreans as the Russians become closer. In my discussions, I've had meetings with PLA officials, with party officials about these issues. And they have said to me, no, they do not like it when the Russians visit North Korea or make these types of arrangements. But there's not a lot that they can really do about it. It also makes them lose leverage over North Korea in particular. They also feel like in a lot of cases, the Russians, by involving the North Koreans, create some instability that might derail Beijing's broader ambitions with respect to Taiwan. In particular, and this goes to some of the questions we might talk about in the Q&A, China it cannot win a war over Taiwan that involves U.S. allies and partners in Asia. And what I mean is direct involvement. Like if Japan were to fight to defend Taiwan or South Korea were to fight to defend Taiwan, there's no situation under which China could win. And so their strategy is really one in which they're focused on, one, moving quickly enough that they don't really have to engage with the United States. But even if there is military engagement, it does not involve direct engagement with those allies. As North Korea and Russia become closer to China, China is fearful that these countries that tend to be a bit more disruptive in their foreign policies and military policies than China will take certain actions that will cause major changes in Tokyo, in Seoul, and in Europe in particular, to cause a coalition to form such that Europe, NATO starts to see what happens on the Korean Peninsula or over the Taiwan Strait to be vital to their security. And South Koreans start to see Taiwan as vital to their security. And this creates a scenario in which China has a very difficult time winning. So what does this mean for the United States and South Korea? I would argue that this triangle is really unstable and full of contradictions. And so the best thing to do is, not threaten one and say, oh, if you're closer, Russia, if you get close to North Korea, you will be punished, or North Korea, if you get closer to China, you'll be punished. But the number one thing that I've seen historically in these alignments that cause a disruption of the alignment are twofold. The first is unmet expectations. And so when these countries want something from the other and they do not get it, the value of the alignment goes down. When the United States or South Korea or others step in with threats, this provides deniability for why certain things were not provided. So I'll provide an example. China would never have sent military personnel to support Russia in the war in Ukraine, and they never would have sent as well clearly, offensive military systems to Russia. The United States, concerned though that this would happen, issued a series of public demands and threats against China, such that when the Chinese were going to fail to support their ally, instead of it being obvious to the Russians that this support was not forthcoming, they were able to blame the United States for it, thereby preventing, perhaps, a wedge from forming. And then the second thing that causes these countries to disintegrate in terms of their relationship historically is not that they have to have different threat perception. So it's a very high standard to say we want to convince Russia that China is more of a threat to them than the United States is, or convince North Korea that, the Russians are more of a threat to them than the United States is. That is not necessary. What is necessary is that they have different approaches. So all these countries can continue to agree that the main strategic challenger is the United States. But historically, when they have disagreements over how to handle the United States, and in particular, when they feel like their partner's way of doing things creates certain patterns of behavior in the United States and its allies that are bad for them, that's when things tend to fall apart. So we should leverage this. And one of the things that I argue is that China doesn't want to be a part of this bloc. They want all the benefits of the relationship with North Korea and Russia with none of the costs. And so because of that, we should treat them like they are a bloc. We should criticize China when North Korea does something bad, criticize China when Russia does something bad, because this will create that instance in which they start to feel like the alignment is no longer worth it. And of course, we should show that, these threats are, regional, they impact all of us, and continue with some of the major steps that have happened between Japan, South Korea, and U.S. alignment. I will end by saying that I had a very senior party official. I had dinner with a very senior Chinese Communist Party official after I'd published something about these recommendations in Foreign Affairs, and he said he read the article, and I asked him, "Oh, how did you like it?" And he said, "I did not like it." And I said, "What did you not like about it?" Because it argues China doesn't want to be a leader of an autocratic bloc, which I thought he would like because in Washington, that was gaining a lot of traction. And he said, "What I don't like is the idea that we would have to pay the cost of bad Russian or North Korean behavior." So for me, what that shows is that those are viable recommendations. Usually if the Chinese don't like something, it means it's a good idea. And so hopefully that's a little bit of information to help us open up to a greater these issues.
Of course, Chinese care about the grand strategy of the United States, of course, and at the same time, China tried to control many, moving factors and moving parts in here and there. But and then Russia and then North Korea do not listen to China's order. Let's start, from the North Korea's nuclear weapon system, and then there are some conflicting views on this China's position on North Korea's nuclear weapons. And you just made it very clear, and I agree with you that China is not very comfortable with the North Korea's very aggressive first to use type of nuclear weapon strategic tactics. North Korea's nuclear weapon system might be a strategic asset for the China. Of course, you can the pinpoint against the Beijing and Shanghai anytime. It is because North Korea doesn't.
They don't like the idea in the international system that some countries deserve certain things and other countries don't deserve certain things based on whether or not they behave according to kind of Western liberal norms and values. Because of winds and geography and the closeness, there would be nuclear fallout. I've written elsewhere that actually Xi Jinping himself has talked about reunification under a South Korean government. But from the Chinese point of view, why should they pay costs to help the United States? I continue to be convinced that, if it was credible that the U.S. military would leave the Korean Peninsula, if North Korea no longer existed, then China would be much more helpful in dealing with the North Korean issue.
When he told the North Korean ruler that China believes North Korea wants U.S. forces out of South Korea, and then quote unquote, the Kim Jong-un laughed and pounded on the table in the sheer joy, exclaiming that the Chinese were liars and it needs the USFK to protect himself, Kim Jong-un and Jong-un's regime. We know, the Donald Trump administration actually trying to do, global, alignment posture one more time. and then that actually, channels the strategic positions of each country to other, directions.
And on one hand, I do not believe the Chinese have sort of traditional territorial ambitions against Korea. On the other, I think the nature of power has changed in recent years, such that the Chinese recognize they don't have to physically occupy territory to control a country. And in that context, it is absolutely the case that China would see a unified Korea as like a Chinese like vassal state, in that the Korean government, would still exist in all of its complexities, but Chinese power would impose demands on these governments, whether it's the South Korean government, Australian, what have you, so that the sovereignty of countries would be limited. That is China's view of hegemony in Asia. And so they and the Chinese view is that this sort of instability in Asia is caused by the presence of the United States. And to a degree, they're correct, because their view of instability is that countries are not naturally acquiescing to Chinese power. And of course, if the US military were not present in Korea, for example, then the Korean government would have to make different decisions.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting that Donald Trump administration actually give a signal to South Korean government, and then their American ground forces, about 4,500 circulated troops will be removed from Korean Peninsula, and then that actually gave a very bad signal to China and a good signal to North Korea. South Korean strategic community discuss about this very complex situation. If those ground forces, 4,500 soldiers, ground forces, and they are the tripwire, for the North Korean potential invasion on South Korea or South Korea, but it's not harmful to China. But without those 4,500 ground forces, troops, and then entire purpose of American troops on South Korean soil is not heading to North Korea, but heading to China. So this is a very big strategic change in the Korean Peninsula and East Asian security by Donald Trump administration's global posture realignment plan. And then what do you think?
Well, the first thing is, until sometimes it's unclear whether or not these movements have already been decided upon and will be executed versus our leverage in broader negotiations. It has been the case for decades now that the United States has requested from the South Korean government strategic flexibility, which means the ability to use the U.S. forces that are based in South Korea in a contingency against China. And that request has been denied over and over and over again, right? So this is less about, is South Korea going to fight China, and more, can the United States use its assets in South Korea directly in an offensive manner against China? So on one hand, I'd be curious if what the Trump administration is trying to do is to get greater flexibility for those U.S. assets on the Korean Peninsula versus really trying to minimize the footprint. The second thing I think that's important is often what is necessary to reassure allies and partners like South Korea is different than what is necessary to deter China. So, theoretically, we think these things should be the same, right? Same with defense. Our ability to defend should increase deterrence. But actually, given geography, given different perceptions, it is not the same. Any sort of conflict over the Korean Peninsula, we know that for the most part, the ground forces come from the South Koreans. And so mostly what it is air power and other assets coming from the United States. But as technology has evolved, at least with China, a lot of that forward presence puts those forces at such a level of vulnerability that they're no longer able to defend. It is the case that I think the United States has wanted more flexibility for their forces and wants the South Korean military finally to take over operational command and other things so that the United States military can focus more on China and rely on our allies and partners to take on other issues.
In the, say, constraining, China. And then let's move on to Taiwan Strait. You mentioned that if there is something happen between China and Taiwan, China, if invade and then try to take over Taiwan, if South Korea and Japan get involved, or and probably Australia partly, involved in this, war in the Taiwan Strait, and China has no chance to win the war. Either China, assist or help China to win over Taiwan in case.
Well, what I know for certain is that the Chinese do not want the North Koreans or the Russians to take military actions at the same time that they launch a campaign against Taiwan. Because, again, that more likely draws in all the other US allies and partners and makes it more difficult for them to achieve their goals. Even though the United States, of course, has difficulty fighting a two-front war. In the end, we would prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine or, probably, it depends, but we would have to prioritize that. The issue, though, from what I hear from the Chinese, is they don't think they can control Kim Jong-un or Putin. So from Kim Jong-un's perspective, I'm not a North Korean expert, but it does seem like when U.S. forces are tied down doing something else, that would be the most opportune time if you're going to do something to do it then. So I think concerns about multiple conflicts at the same time, those are legitimate concerns, but not because the Chinese are deliberately coordinating those attacks among their North Korean and Russian partners.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
마스트로 박사는 북중러 관계가 강화되는 가운데 삼국이 서로의 이해관계가 일치하지 않고 북한의 잘못된 행위에 대해 공동의 책임을 묻는 방식으로 북중러 공조의 비용을 환기시키는 방식이 효과적이라고 했습니다. 이번 시즌 Now in North Korea 세션에서 중국 열병식에 러시아와 북한이 참여한 현안에 대해 같이 논의했던 개이오 대학의 니시노 준야 교수도 비슷한 언급을 한 바 있습니다. 북한과 중국이 최근 관계 개선에 나선 이유가 북중러 블록을 강화하는 한 측면과 향후 미국과의 협상의 또 한 측면을 염두에 두었기 때문일 것입니다. 한국은 중국과 북한의 외교 관계에서 어떠한 위치에 있는지 다시 한번 검토해 봐야겠습니다.